Welcome, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this series on emerging from challenging times. I'm Miriam Good, Director of Mind Science, and tonight's session is on reflections. You can learn all about mind science and our work and all about Lindsay Bira, our speaker tonight, by visiting our website, www.mindscience.org. And remember to say hello in the chat and to use the Q&A for your questions. So let's jump in.
Welcome everyone to part 2 of this 4-part series. Last time for part 1, we talked about setting intentions that work. We're going to weave that in a little bit here, but today is all about reflecting on this time that we've been in through the pandemic, a little bit post-pandemic, but we're still in it. We don't exactly know what's happening or what will happen next. There's a lot of uncertainty. And within this, a big question that we have is, how do we shift this very big stress that has been different for everyone into growth? This happens very naturally over time with hard situations, but as a psychologist and in the field of research, looking at how our brain adapts to things, the questions are, how do we make this happen faster? So that's what we're here to discuss today. As you guys know, I am a clinical health psychologist. I'm also an assistant professor of psychiatry at UT Health. And one of my specialties over time has been stress and adapting to stress, and also post-traumatic stress in the face of course, trauma. We're going to be touching a little bit on that here as we define some things, but let's get into it. Like we talked about last time, life in general comes with struggle. We can't change that. We can't get rid of discomfort. We cannot just snap out of negative emotions. The point is to really understand how to move through them. And what we're going to be talking about today is grow because of them. Growth happens through discomfort. That's just unfortunately how it goes. Now, with the pandemic, there's been an added layer of struggle, but it's still a part of life. A pandemic is part of being human and alive. It's just a whole other layer of things that we have to deal with and a lot of changes, which does make the struggle a little bit heavier to carry. What we're going to be focusing on today is what we do in response to that struggle that actually adds on a layer that we do not need to carry. This can be unhelpful thinking or unhelpful interpretations. This can be avoidance coping or even judgment, and a few other things that we're going to talk about how to notice and then shift away from so that we are all maximizing our growth. As we remember, and I talked about this last time, the brain is tricky. So just like we see the movement in here and we know that this is an optical illusion and there's not actually movement, no matter how much we know that, we can't turn it off. This is the same thing with how our brain responds to stress in difficult times. We're going to have an automatic process that if we can notice, then we have power over. We're not going to believe in it as much. It still is going to happen. But when we get to know ourselves and our reactions, then we can catch it and shift away so that we're not being ruled by it. Same thing with these optical illusions. We can see it happening, but we're not just kind of tricked by the optical illusion. We know it's not actually moving. Now we're here to really build up our emotional intelligence. So this is just getting really good or better at noticing, labeling, and monitoring what we're feeling. So what our brain does immediately. Also noticing and labeling and monitoring what others are feeling and being able to use all that information to appropriately and helpfully guide our thinking and behavior. This leads to a lot of benefits. And through this series, we're talking about things that not only you can relate to yourself, but I also want you to think about other people in your life and how you might be able to use some of this to help others grow as well, or just have a response when somebody else is struggling, help them have a little path forward. Whenever we talk about this, we are exercising the frontal lobe. So the prefrontal cortex is what slows everything down, calms things down. It helps with attention, memory, concentration, controlling our emotions, controlling our behaviors, with our relationships, everything. The problem is when our stress brain, our animal brain fires up, it shuts down our frontal lobe. So just by being here, if we could all look at our brains in an MRI, we would see more frontal lobe activation than maybe 10 minutes ago, because we're concentrating, we're sitting, we're learning, and we're practicing some emotional intelligence and building that area. So let's move through a couple of definitions here. So what we want to talk about is how we change a stress response at a difficult time into a growth path. That's really, I think, the trick of life, is figuring out and understanding how to not get too caught up in some of the horror and the difficulty and even trauma that life presents, because there's no way to escape from that, right? That's just part of being human and alive. So our job is to understand how to think about it and how to behave in response to it that maximizes our own well-being and life trajectory. That's every single person's personal responsibility. But we have to understand what's going on, and then we have to have tools to help us get on that path. That's what we're talking about. Now, if we look at stress, there can be many different definitions of stress, but a main one that we talk about in psychology is that stress is the mental or emotional strain or tension that results from adverse or very demanding circumstances. Another definition that I like is stress happens when a situation's demands exceed our immediate resources to cope. So we do not feel that in control, we feel a little bit overwhelmed. Now, if we look at a term like burnout, so this was a big kind of pop psychology term, and it is used and measured in research. There's a lot of research at this point on burnout. It's usually talked about within the career psychology world. So what happens with burnout is there's stress, and then if stress lasts for a long time, then it can lead into the state of burnout. Burnout is a prolonged mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion that's caused by excessive and prolonged stress. Now, burnout is a little bit harder to turn off. So we might have an immediate stress response, but then we can get out of that. If that immediate stress is happening a lot, now we have more of a chronic burnout response. This affects our mood, this affects our motivation, our energy, it creates irritability, it creates avoidance, all kinds of different symptoms that we get from this, and it's harder to get rid of. Now, if we can remove the stressor, usually we come out of it pretty easily, but it's kind of what our nervous system does when our world is just not rewarding. And this is why they measure it in work, because one of our biggest stressors as humans nowadays is not the lion that's chasing us in the fields, it is burnout from traffic and our jobs. So that's important to kind of understand that term. Now, another nervous system response is resulting from trauma. Trauma, by definition, is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So usually we define this as an acute event that causes distress and disturbance, sometimes shock or horror, although it does not have to come with that diagnostically. If we're trying to check the box for a criteria of trauma, we do not have a sense of shock or horror. We don't have to have that, because sometimes people zone out or don't remember, but it can definitely be a trauma that affects them over time. So now that we have these three layers kind of defined, so just kind of stress, then we have this burnout from prolonged stress. Now we have a very acute event, which can be chronic, kind of this big one called trauma. What does our nervous system do in response to these? Well, let's break down trauma. I forgot about this slide. Let's break down trauma just a little bit more. So when we have trauma, I started talking about this, we can have acute trauma, we can have chronic trauma, and we can have complex trauma. Complex trauma comes especially when trauma has been experienced in childhood, when there's been more interpersonal trauma. Our brains have much more difficulty making sense of another human wishing harm on us, especially if that human is supposed to be a caregiver. That's more complex in nature. So we can have one event like a car accident and that's it. We can have something chronic. So this might be something like combat trauma or domestic violence. We can have more complex trauma, which domestic violence can fall into, childhood abuse also. If we look at different types of trauma and how we categorize them in research when we're looking at outcomes of PTSD, this can be a natural disaster. Ding, ding, ding. Let's pause on that one. The pandemic. So here we are experiencing a natural disaster that absolutely qualifies as a trauma. And it makes a lot of sense to have some post-traumatic stress symptoms as a result of going through this. We're going to talk a little bit about what those symptoms are, kind of this natural response to stress, specifically what the pandemic has caused for people. So we're going to get into that in a second. But that's what we want to kind of acknowledge there is a natural disaster is absolutely a trauma. It disrupts our worldview, our identity, our normal routines, and changes the way that we feel and kind of move through the world. So it qualifies. An accident, of course, people understand that's a trauma. A physical trauma of some kind that can be physical abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse or sexual assault, anything that happens in childhood in those domains, absolutely very traumatic. And that has a bigger effect over time. And then we can also have medical traumas. So this is one that's a little bit newer, but anytime somebody goes through a medical procedure, a surgery, even childbirth, it can have a traumatic quality. And we're starting to understand a lot more about that. So this is just how we qualify trauma within the research and how we track it and measure it. Now, when we look at the response to trauma, so post-traumatic stress, and I want to normalize some of this. Now, I'm not talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? So it's not diagnostic, but if you are human and alive, you definitely have post-traumatic stress symptoms as a result of some trauma in your life. That's just a very normal reaction to an abnormal experience, like I've written there. Let's say that again. Post-traumatic stress is a normal reaction to an abnormal experience. Up to 3 months after a trauma, post-traumatic stress symptoms are considered normal. Definitely a month after, but it takes up to 3 months for those to normally resolve. Now, about 90% of people at those 3 month marks, they don't have many post-traumatic stress symptoms that are bothering them. So they return to kind of that baseline of functioning or have some post-traumatic growth, which we're going to get into, but that's normal. At the 3 month mark, if those symptoms are still very high, that would be when somebody might meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So I always want to make that line clear, because when we hear post-traumatic stress, we have this mental health stigma as if that's a disorder and functioning is gone and it's not okay. I'm here to say that we as human beings have these types of response, and we need to understand them as normal and accept them as a part of being a human alive so that we can move through them and not be scared by them. Okay, symptoms of PTSD. This is re-experiencing and intrusions. So feeling as if something's happening again or having thoughts about it when we don't want to. Nightmares pop in there. So we can kind of reflect on some of this as we've been through the pandemic, what has played on our minds. We can have a sense of hyperarousal. So this is where our nervous system is just geared up to detect a threat, almost like we're radaring more than we usually do. So we're more aware of things. We might have difficulty sleeping. We also might feel on edge. We might be irritable because our nervous system is cranked up. This can also be anxiety. Even sometimes it's cranked up enough to reach the threshold of a panic attack. So that can happen here. We then have avoidance. When our nervous system is cranked up and things don't feel right, the best way that our brain says to cope is to avoid some things. That can be adaptive in a pandemic because we're avoiding the actual threat and taking care of ourselves. But as things start to return to normal, we might notice more avoidance patterns because we just don't feel comfortable. We have to figure out where that line is of helpful behavior versus non-helpful response or unhelpful response. And then the last symptom cluster is where we have changes in cognition and mood for the long term. So our thoughts about ourselves, other people in the world has shifted in negative ways. This usually falls in 5 domains: thoughts about safety, trust, power and control, esteem, and intimacy. And then our mood shifts. We might feel more depressed, more irritable, numb, tearful, or fearful, and we just can't shake that over time. Again, within the first 3 months after a big situation, trauma, this is very normal, but then we want things to start to kind of shake out. So this is just good to be aware of. Now, specific to the pandemic, and we went over this very briefly last time, there are specific stress responses that we've had as a result of this natural disaster trauma that's been very prolonged, okay? So one of the first things that our body does in response to stress is it has a shift in our biorhythms. Our biorhythms, like I talked about last time, it's a 24-hour sleep cycle or a 1.5 second heart rate, right? So these biorhythms can be super short depending on what it is or very long. And so these are all driven by chemicals. When we get stressed and we get off our routine, one of the first things to get off whack is our chemicals, and that changes how our body functions. So a very normal response to stress is having difficulty with sleep, difficulty with appetite, noticing those types of changes, heart fluttering. It just makes sense. Our biorhythms are getting disrupted, but it's not dangerous. So that's important, just kind of honor our body's response, but not be scared by it. Many people are reporting a sense of time has shifted. I know I've experienced that a lot. So somebody who has had COVID can experience that even more so. We're seeing that there might be some neurological effects of this, but also just not having the correct anchor points in time and living a normal life makes us lose sense of time, and that can be very unsettling. Our identity has also been shifted. The things that we used to do, the people we used to spend time with, how we identified ourselves, it's just different now. And sometimes we can feel kind of lost in that. There's also a big sense of loneliness that people are experiencing. Now, we're talking about this kind of in two ways. The pandemic shut everything down. There was loneliness there. Our world has opened up significantly, but people are still feeling lonely, and sometimes more than they were when everything was shut down. Because now when we're forced to get out in the world, we're realizing we don't have those same connections that we did. We're not feeling as close to people. Things aren't feeling as natural. It's feeling clunkier in social settings. There can be many reasons for that, but it comes down to feeling lonely and not right socially. We can also have a very natural mood and anxiety response, and some of that post-traumatic stress response that we just talked about. It falls both in those categories, mood and anxiety. So when we look at a stress and trauma response, it all boils down to what we call our limbic system activation. This is where the fight or flight response happens. If a bear pops out in the woods, that area in the brain in the middle there is going to flare up, and our frontal lobe is going to cool it down when the bear is gone and we are safe. When it's something like a chronic trauma or a chronic stressor over time, then our brain learns to just stay engaged. This can be something as benign as daily traffic that's very frustrating. We have to slam on our brakes and worry about being late and the threats that might be there at work. Or it can be something as big as a virus where we don't know what the right thing to do is. We don't know what's safe, what's not. How do we set that line for ourselves? It's a lot. So we basically train our nervous system, that area, the limbic system, to be online a little bit more. That's why we have these symptoms. When we think about resiliency, now over time, when the stressor starts to go away, or we start to kind of be able to practice new ways of being, that fire usually goes down. Again, for 90% of people, even after a trauma, resiliency happens and PTSD symptoms go down and they return to baseline functioning or experience post-traumatic growth. Sometimes that does stick around though. So when we talk about resiliency and post-traumatic growth, let's define this for a second. So resiliency is the ability to mentally and emotionally cope with a crisis or return to pre-crisis status quickly. So you can kind of reflect maybe in different crises or stressors or even traumas in your life when you've been able to access this, when you've kind of shown some resiliency versus when you've gotten stuck. And there's many reasons why we're more easily able to step into resiliency or not. It depends on a lot of different factors. There's also a genetic component of this. Some people are just more able to do this naturally. So we can kind of reflect on our lives and when we've been able to do that. We can also reflect on when we've perceived other people being able to do that, and also know that there are many factors in somebody's life that changes the way they're coping with the exact same trauma. So this is not something that we judge or assume that somebody should just snap back into a resilient state or going back pre-crisis, because there's just factors here that sometimes we will never know and we have to honor. But that's essentially how we define resiliency and what we hope to work towards. Now, post-traumatic growth is, we define this as a positive psychological change as a result of adversity or challenges that leads to a higher level of functioning. So it's not just returning to pre-crisis functioning, it's actually growing to a higher level of functioning because we experienced that adversity, challenge, and trauma. Most people do experience this when they're interviewed time after a trauma. Most do report having experienced post-traumatic growth, and we're here to talk about how we get that moving more quickly. You do have this first handouts, as you guys know. With every presentation, I will include handouts to kind of get the thinking going and some reflection. This is the post-traumatic growth inventory, the PTGI. It is available on the public domain, and at the bottom of it lists a lot of really great research citations. So if you wanted to look up the original article or some research that's been done on this, go for it. It's on this handout. And you can also fill this out. So you can kind of look at a crisis that you've been through. You can put it in the context of the pandemic and coming out of kind of post-pandemic, or what are we in? We're not sure. Looking at it in that context, or something else that's happened in your life recently, years before. Reflect on that and kind of notice what you've gotten from that. And it has a way to rate that at the bottom of there, seeing where you fall. It's a really great measure, been used very consistently. It's valid and reliable. What it measures are these 5 factors that we consider in terms of post-traumatic growth. One is our ability to relate to others after a trauma. 2 is our ability to find new possibilities. 3, being able to find a new personal strength. 4, having some type of spiritual change. And that can be, as we know, spirituality can be defined as absolutely anything. It can be even just a connection to nature or connection to our own life, or it can be a connection to a greater energy or greater power. And it can absolutely be attached to religion, but it can be many different things. And 5 is a greater appreciation for life. So that's a little bit of a perspective shift and a sense of gratitude that comes from that. So you can look at how you fall on those 5 different domains. Now, when we look at growth, we're talking about adaptation, resiliency, making new meaning, gaining new skills. With these issues that the pandemic has brought, so these are kind of the common struggles that people have seen. When we have a sense of growth after the struggle in those domains, what we tend to tap into might be more body awareness as a change of kind of our sleep patterns, our different biorhythms. We might have more of an openness in terms of not needing to control time as much, kind of this letting go and saying, oh, well, I can't remember when that happened or when I saw that person last. 1 month feels like 4 months feel like 1. We're just not sure which way it goes, but we're here for it. So we're going to kind of unfold into it, that sense of openness that we might not have had in the beginning when losing that sense of time was kind of worrying us. With loss of identity comes recreation of identity in ways that never would have been possible. So we can have new connections, new realizations, new hobbies, new skills. Loneliness might turn into a sense of gratitude or valuing different relationships differently, kind of seeing what equals equality relationships or what we want to kind of get out of our life and bring more into, even things that we want to develop in terms of hobbies or our relationship with ourself. So that's something that loneliness can really lead into growth and gratitude. And even struggling with mood and anxiety can give us perspective as we learn how to manage those symptoms over time. Again, I want to put a giant pin in this and say, this is not about glossy positive thinking. and we don't push anybody to get to this spot, not even ourselves. So we let go of all shame, judgment, guilt, and the pressure that we might feel to just get to that spot, because that's actually the opposite of what will create growth. What we have to do is be willing to fully experience the distress and discomfort of the situation in order to move through it. The more we fight against it, we get into glossy avoidance, and that's something that locks in struggles over time. You've also probably heard of the term toxic positivity. That's being thrown around a lot. If we're trying to just jump to this, or if we hear somebody struggling and say, you just need to be grateful for what you have. Toxic positivity, it's not helpful. It's actually damaging. We want to honor the struggle, and that's what creates growth. Okay, so how do we cope well? How do we grow? And how can we support those processes in ourselves and others? What this boils down to is really understanding what life brings, what life is, and our natural response to it, and then weaving in evidence-based approaches that are based on neuroscience and behavioral science and how we understand our experience of the world. So this falls into a category of therapy that we call cognitive behavioral therapy. We can take the word therapy out and just say cognitive behavioral approaches, evidence-based approaches. Essentially what this is better understanding our brain and our world and our brain's response to our world, shifting our mindset and perspective so that we can better emotionally regulate. That's the cognitive piece. And then choosing behavioral responses that move us forward instead of keep us stuck or move us backwards. So that's the behavioral piece, cognitive and behavioral. So education, then cognitive and behavioral. So let's kind of work through this here. We have 4 steps to fostering growth. So one, first we just have to be in it. So let's acknowledge that again. So here we are in the distress, right? So as we're willing to experience the distress, now we want to observe what we're saying to ourselves about it. So number 1, we want to shift our thoughts. So if you find yourself asking, why me? Or how could this happen? Or why not me? Why did that happen to somebody else and not me? This is unhelpful thinking, and it's actually wildly unrealistic. This is us fighting against the statistical reality of what we're in. We want to change why me, or how could this happen, to why not me, or of course this happens. Statistically, in the world, to human beings, this kind of thing would happen. Even if it's a diagnosis of something that we get, so a new medical issue, if we're saying, why does this happen to me? I've done everything right, diet and exercise, however we try to justify that. We want to shift that into, well, why not me? That immediately gives us a better sense of perspective and helps us attach to some of the statistics around people who experience this, other people who've also gone through it, just the statistics around it happening and the total random occurrence of what it's like to be alive. That sometimes things just happen and that's life. So why not me gets us there. Number 2, I mentioned this last time, and this is going to be a very common thread that we're going to keep coming back to because it's one of the most important aspects of mindfulness and resiliency and everything that we talk about. We want to practice radical acceptance and gentle curiosity. This first one kind of leads us naturally into this second step. You have handout number 2 on radical acceptance and gentle curiosity. Let's just pause for a second and look at what this is. Radical acceptance is essentially just being able to say, well, okay, why am I experiencing this bad experience? Because bad experiences are part of being human and alive. That's just the reality. Statistically, we will go through them if we are moving through the world. That is just statistics. And when we accept that reality, then we have less stress, less fighting against the reality, less questioning that we can't find the answer to, and more ability to thrive. So kind of saying to ourselves in a bad situation, this is simply a statistical reality. It is what it is. If we're kind of, judging ourselves or trying to undo the past, we have to say to ourselves, and this is a great sentence to keep on hand, I tried the best that I could with the information that I had in the situation that I was in based on who I was at the time. we do too much judging of our previous selves when our previous selves were not as developed as we are now. And our previous self probably didn't know the outcome. So we were just crunching things in that situation. A lot of times we forget all the factors that were going on. This is a huge piece. We actually have a whole module around guilt and shame in evidence-based treatment for PTSD. And essentially it kind of boils down to being able to access this. I tried the best that I could with the information that I had in the situation I was in based on who I was at the time. I honor that. It liberates us. That's radical acceptance of the reality that we experienced and the reality that we have. Last item there is, if I choose to have this role, then I also choose the distress or problems that come with it. I can tolerate it. If I choose to be a driver on public roads, then I also choose traffic and potentially fender benders or an accident sometimes. Those are all a statistical reality every time we get in the car. So when we hit traffic, isn't it funny that we say, why is this happening? I can't handle this. Not today. All the drivers are stupid, right? That's our indicator. And we don't want to judge ourselves for that response. That's just our brain. So that's our indicator, though, to say, wait a minute, this is a statistical part of driving. If I choose to be a driver, then I'm choosing to experience this. I just happen to be in it now. Radical acceptance. Okay. We can literally feel our nervous system and our perspective shift with that. Gentle curiosity is what we step into next. This is a soft interest in the experience at hand, good or bad. Even through bad times, we can be interested in this experience of being alive. And because we are human, we are never alone in anything. This is a shared human experience. The pandemic is an example of a very collective experience. I just saw data actually that suicides went significantly down as a result of, or during the pandemic. We thought it was going to get worse. And I think we're actually going to see that with difficulty coping afterwards. Who knows? We'll see what the data says. But the reason why we're hypothesizing that suicides went down was because this is a very collective shared experience. A big predictor of suicide is feeling extremely isolated in your own problems and a burden to everyone else. Well, guess what? In the pandemic, everybody had the shared problems and we were connected during that. And we weren't necessarily the burden, kind of the outdoor world was, right? And other things. And, it was a complex time. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about shared experience. And the moment that we can kind of tap into that, like, this is horrible feeling. And also many humans have gone through that. And let me think about that for a second, kind of the shared experience of human suffering. So we can have a soft interest in that. Again, acceptance and curiosity does not mean liking, condoning, wanting at all. It's just simply accepting that this is a statistical reality and willing to experience something human. We can also ask ourselves, how many other people have gone through this? How have others coped and gotten through the worst case scenario? And even in times of intense distress, we can say, wow, isn't it interesting how strong my nervous system makes the feeling of emotion? I can observe that and feel it and use it to grow based on my values. This is an amazing exercise to be present with the distress, like we were talking about. Okay, so we have shifting those thoughts that starts to get us into radical acceptance and gentle curiosity. We want to really understand and practice radical acceptance and gentle curiosity. And then number 3, we want to set intentions. This gets into everything that we talked about in part 1, the setting intentions that work. We want to find values and focus on things that we can control within the chaos that we can't control. Maybe we can move our body, choose good food consistently, reach out to others, recreate our identity, and continue to move forward. The last one here relates to 2 things that we found in research that predict post-traumatic growth, and that's openness to experience and extroversion. And the reason why extroversion relates is because that just puts somebody easily out in the world and they form relationships that end up creating a lot of resiliency. So we don't have to be an extrovert, but we can learn from what is effective with extroverts and then intentionally try to create that in our life. So that's still possible. So being open to experience and forming new relationships. We want to practice letting go of any fantasies we had, any rigid outcomes or ideals that we're hanging on to that's creating so much stress. Here's our reality world, and here's the big ideal world. In that gap is a lot of distress. We want to let go of that. We want to let other realities and outcomes take shape over time. We're here for it. We're just going to experience it. And we want to connect with others through this shared experience, even if it's something like a diagnosis of cancer. Hopefully that does not happen, but obviously statistically this happens to people and is, one of the main causes of morbidity and what people experience at the end of life. This is just a fact. So when that happens, one of the best things that we can do for our brain and mental emotional state is connect with other people who are also going through the same thing. We get oxytocin from that. We get bonding, so many good things. I could do an entire presentation on just that, but it's extremely important to connect with others through shared experience. That could be one-on-one. That could be finding a group that has other people kind of sharing the same viewpoint. It's very healthy. So this is what we're going to step into step by step in everyday practice to foster better post-traumatic growth. And again, through this, we're not trying to jump to glossy positivity. We are honoring the experience and we are willing to experience the distress as we reorient to some helpful things. You have this in a handout. So you will have this to come to. Take a screenshot on your phone, observe this and review this every day and see what you can step into. Same thing with the radical acceptance sheet. Just like I did last time, I left you with one book, The Happiness Trap, which is based on acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a cognitive behavioral approach. Same thing here. This is actually, this one, the workbook is made by the authors of the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory. So after all their research, they put it into action and made this book. It's a good one. There's also another one. So this is the New Psychology of Post-Traumatic Growth. This is also really good. And the last one is made by the same author, written by the same author as the one I gave to you last time, The Happiness Trap. Based on acceptance and commitment therapy. I love that approach, just so helpful. That's radical acceptance, gentle curiosity. So you have 3 resources here. If you wanted to tap in and dig a little bit deeper, this would be a great way to do so. So that concludes the presentation on shifting stress into growth. We will move into the question and answer piece. I look forward to hearing from you all and thinking through it with you. Thanks so much. Thanks for everyone who tuned in tonight. So I'm looking forward to hearing some questions about this because, as a psychologist and doing these presentations, and I've done so many throughout the pandemic, it's always difficult to present so much information in a short amount of time. So I want to kind of asterisk everything in there and say how nuanced and different everybody's experience of this is. And so as we move through these presentations, this is the second one, and we'll talk about the next one in a second as we kind of close up. But this is kind of your space to reflect on what your experience through the pandemic has been, kind of the general human experience. As you send through questions, it doesn't have to be related to the pandemic. I mean, send through anything that feels relevant. So I'm happy to answer.
Well, I wanted to start, Lindsay, with asking you about the importance or how knowing that a traumatic event is over. So if you're in a car accident, it happens, it's over, and then that 3-month clock starts ticking. So we're in the middle of a pandemic. How important will it be for there to be some acknowledgement at some point that it's for all intents and purposes over as much as it's going to be over, or will it even be possible to do that? And if it's not possible to do that, can we have an internal time when we say it's over? Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. I actually love this question because boy, doesn't it feel good to have closure and some external force telling us that there's a hard line and now we are free to let go of worries or other habits or whatever it is. We have the answer, right? That always feels so good. It would be so helpful if we get to a point where we say, or some entity is in agreement that we can move forward in whatever that means, right? It's going to be interesting to see if we get there, because this thing is so complex and it keeps evolving. And, like we've been kind of going back and forth with how we're even referring to this phase. Somebody last time I really liked, they said peri-pandemic. So, here we are, peri-pandemic, wanting to move towards post-pandemic, but there is no hard line. This is where, as everything is getting more complex and, some research is coming out, it kind of lends to needing to make a personal decision. This is where we have an internal hard line. And this is basically how much we're willing to sacrifice for how long, and where that risk reward balance starts to tip. So of course, beginning of pandemic, high risk of getting COVID, and we don't know much about it. And, we definitely don't want to get it. We now have vaccines that greatly reduce the risk of getting it. So we've got some protection, but it doesn't take care of everything, right? So there's still this uncertainty. What we're now experiencing, and kind of what we talked about in this presentation, is after a long time of huge radical change in a pandemic, our social connections are going away, our freedom moving through the world is gone, people feel very scared about traveling. That can only happen for so long before it becomes really heavy and exhausting. So I think that's something for everybody to think too, as we sit, not quite at the 2-year mark, 1.5 years or so, of, at what point do you make a personal decision for your own well-being that enters into a new domain in order to maintain that balance? Because, after 6 months, this is where we see kind of this chronic kind of burnout. After 6 months, this is where things get very hard to cope with. Yeah. So I think it's hard to say what the answer to that is, but it's good to reflect on.
Right. Super. We do have a question from Martha. I've read a little bit about the vagus nerve and have seen some exercises on YouTube to reset the vagus nerve. Are these effective or pseudoscience? Can you explain how prolonged stress affects the vagus nerve or our nervous system, and recommend ways to promote physical healing?
Yes. So the vagus nerve is actually, it's very much science-based. A lot of the approaches to calm the vagus nerve tend to be kind of like these quick hacks that, I think probably some of them work, and different people respond to different things. So you can definitely try them. I think they're pretty simple, and the ones that I've seen, aren't too dangerous. My favorite hack into the nervous system is diaphragmatic breathing. And there is so much evidence that as soon as we adjust our breath in a specific way, we hack into our nervous system, and our heart rate drops, our blood pressure drops, and our body temperature even starts to drop. Our galvanic skin response, we're just not as reactive to things. And so this is basically taking one deep inhale for 4 seconds, holding it. So you hold it at the top, just kind of let that oxygen saturate, and then you spend twice as long letting it out. So if you inhale for 4, hold it for a couple seconds, then you want to exhale for 8. When we do that, we have a change in our heart rate, where our heart rate really slows down on the out breath. That's when we want to really elongate the out breath. That is a nervous system response. So that's a really good thing to try. If you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling on edge, if you're having some type of tachycardia, you can try that because it lowers your heart rate. All of this is nervous system based. When I think about post-traumatic stress disorder, I think about the brain and nervous system literally being hijacked, to where if somebody bangs on the wall, the startle response is so huge. And we know that we cannot control that type of response. So what we end up having to do is retrain the nervous system over time, which means we need to expose ourselves to situations that are different now, but might remind us of something really difficult slowly over time, so that our nervous system has a chance to recondition, to desensitize to the threat, and what we call habituate for a new response.
We have a question here. I was hit by a truck early in August. I'm so sorry. While walking, and am experiencing a sense of loss. I can no longer do so many of the things I've done in my active life. And there is a question as to whether my knee will be permanently impacted. How do I cope with being in a state of uncertainty about my body and what I'll be able to do in the future without going crazy?
That is such a hard place to be. First of all, I just want to validate that. Injuries are one of the hardest things, because your body is not working like you're used to it working. And it's a huge adjustment and very scary, and has a trajectory risk, right? So this is a very hard place to be. I think we cannot deny that there's a buffer zone. I mean, August was not that long ago at all. So you are still very much in a body healing tissue response phase. So, and I don't know your medical condition, of course, but I do know the body takes a while for that inflammation to go down. So you're just in the hardest part of it right now. And so we have to reorient to kind of going with the flow. So this is radical acceptance. So this has happened to me. Statistically, people go through injuries. I would connect with people in your life, anybody who can find who has gone through a significant injury and who's, much out of it at this point, if they feel helpful to connect with. Sometimes if somebody's not a good emotional supporter, they're just too glossy about it, like, oh, you'll be fine, time heals all or something. And that's not quite helpful. But somebody you can actually talk to about how hard a recovery is, an adjustment. Sometimes people forget because it ends up being so far in the past. So I would say radical acceptance. If you can find some books on acceptance and commitment therapy, I think we just put one up here, and there's that one from last time, The Happiness Trap, to kind of keep your mind busy. And I think the most important moments of a day are right when you wake up and before you're going to bed, especially if you're struggling with your mood or anxiety or some type of adjustment. Because as soon as you wake up, that assumes you've even been sleeping. So as soon as you wake up, this is where all those anxious thoughts ensue. If you can find a good podcast or something that kind of makes you think about things from a higher level and not just kind of focused on the limitations, that can cue the brain very well for the rest of the day and close the day out with something like that as well. So just start to play it so that your brain is pulled this way, kind of not down the path of fear. Sometimes people also choose medication to go through an adjustment period like this because injuries are really, really tough. Talk about a trauma that impacts your functioning in all areas and your mood. So that's something that I suggest to people too. Why not talk to your doctor and see if there's something that could just help a little bit with coping with it. So those are just some quick suggestions that I would have.
Super. Okay, we have another question. What are some ways to practice radical acceptance when what we're accepting is unknown? Anxiety and fear love the unknown.
Yes. The uncertainty. Yeah. So, and this is part of radical acceptance, really, because what is that quote? Who said this? I can't remember, but the only thing certain in life is uncertainty. Somebody said that. And it's true. Unfortunately, there is so much uncertainty in life, and what we're dealing with most times, just like, this person shared with us about the car accident or this whole pandemic we're in, or, are we going to be okay tomorrow? None of us can actually answer that question. And it kind of, freaks us out a little bit whenever we stop and notice how much uncertainty is there. But we usually move forward with radical acceptance and radical trust that generally things are fine as long as I align with my values. So those are a couple key things there, that uncertainty is actually one of the biggest pieces of being alive. So we can definitely practice radical acceptance about uncertainty. And then what we can always do in any moment, no matter how much chaos and uncertainty is going on, is say, what do I care about most? Who do I want to be within this? And that attaches us to our values and gives us a little roadmap forward.
I love that. Okay. I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to ask one. I'm full of questions. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on the exhaustion level that I keep hearing, experiencing myself, but also keep hearing from just about everybody that I come in contact with. At this point, everybody is exhausted, almost a little bit, not out of the blue, but I'm surprised at still being exhausted.
I know.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, one piece of this we can kind of close out in one variable is COVID effects, post-COVID effects. We know that this does last a while, and that might be related to that. But even if somebody has not had COVID, this exhaustion is there. And what I really think it is there's a couple of layers. One, we do not have these normal anchor points in a normal schedule. So we don't have things that we're looking at that we can anchor in time that actually cause us motivation now. There's research on when you plan a vacation, the most joy and reward that you get is in the planning process and looking forward to it. The vacation is never as good as it was to be excited about it. So I think we're missing that. We can't plan. And every time we try to plan, something big happens and we have to cancel our plans. So we're missing kind of this natural pull and energy towards plans in the future. So I think that's a piece of it. I also think we have been inundated by such intense conversations about the pandemic and the virus, about politics, about all of this stuff. And we just see this aggression and opposing teams calling each other idiots, right? And just how tough that is. It has split up families. It has split up friends. So not only are we being isolated because of the pandemic and social isolation, but also this is causing conflicts in our own homes. And think about the level of exhaustion that is. You know, it's fighting and conversations that we really haven't had in the same way before, about something that's so very uncertain and nobody actually has the answers. So I think that that's a factor in it too. So I think there's so many factors that play into that. And I think on the one hand, we just have to accept it as part of this really weird experience and keep aligning with values of exercise, social time, and try to reduce conflict resolution. Let's not engage in these big discussions or assume that the opposing person thinking something differently is an idiot or so stupid. You know, if we really did a panel, we could probably find interesting information. It gets complicated. We just don't want to poke that bear too much because it actually really erodes our well-being.
Thank you. And here's our final question is very much related to that. How do we regain energy? I have turned into a blob. It feels like nothing really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is a really good example of some burnout. It's also a good example of kind of the mood symptoms that burnout leads to and the effects of chronic stress over time. The system is exhausted. What we need to be creating is more vibrancy and connection to ourselves and other people. So what I would recommend, and this is straight up kind of behavioral activation science, is to start getting really good about habits, daily habits. Again, I'm going to go back to that podcast in the morning. Find something that inspires you a little bit, whatever that is, and start playing it as soon as you get up in the morning. And then try to get on some type of schedule. So I always recommend, we know that some of the best benefit and use of our time is exercise, brain benefit, blood flow benefit, body benefit, mood, everything. Now, when you exercise, you don't feel good about exercising and you don't get like this huge benefit that's like life-changing, but it's the consistency over time that ends up bringing that. So that, along with just like getting good food in your body, making sure you connect with people, and starting to go more on adventures. What are the things that you've left behind, hobbies that used to really inspire you, or can you learn a new skill? Sometimes going back to an old hobby that we used to enjoy, we actually get more depressed around it because it doesn't feel the same and we just feel disconnected from our old self. Learn a radically new skill. Go out there and start scuba diving. Go on a scuba diving trip and start from the ground up and just kind of shake things up for yourself. I promise that that will get better. You know, I'll give one last example for this question is I often work with people who are having suicidal ideations. And, you know, nobody can stop anybody from harming themselves, right? Not even the psychologist. It's possible, not a family member, not a partner. So, you know, it's something that can happen. But what I tell people is, okay, you know, if that's something that you're considering, I can't, you know, get in your brain and stop that. But if before you would ever do anything, I want you to move to Hawaii for 6 months and live on a farm mangoes, surf every day, just for 6 months, because, you know, why not? And if you're thinking about the other option anyway, just go. And the reason why I suggest that is because it's a radical shift that changes the value set and changes the way the brain is experiencing the world. And that often helps a lot. Now, most people can't do that. We're not going to do that. But it gets back to how can we create more novelty in our environment and start a new chapter?
Super. Okay, we actually have 2 questions here that we can go through pretty quickly because I think they're fairly related. The pandemic has a snowball effect. Part of that is an uptick in divorce. My profession specializes in that. There seems to be such trauma with divorce. How does one console or help such a client? And then what I think is kind of a related question. One of my observations of post-traumatic growth during the pandemic is the importance of respecting the needs of those with whom we disagree, and truly listen to them. Can you reflect on that?
Yeah. So touching base on the relationship piece, I've seen some of those stats, and divorce and breakups, did go up significantly. And it's because we're in an unnatural environment. I don't know when the last time was that people spent like all day, every day with their partner. We're not supposed to. You're supposed to have time apart. So it makes sense on the one hand. I think also getting at the second question there is, there's been a lot of disagreement and differing opinions on this and differing needs that people have. And those needs and who they are has shaped how they approach thinking about the virus, how they approach thinking about the vaccine. And we can't really say that any of those approaches are inherently right or wrong. This is why this gets argued up to the Supreme Court level sometimes. And then sometimes there's never even an answer to that. And also science changes all the time. I'm not saying pro or against absolutely anything. This is just a cognitive flexibility skill that we can take a step back and say, okay, people have differing opinions because of who they are and the factors in their life. When we can attach to that, that helps us deal with people and respect differing opinions instead of reacting as if they're causing some immediate harm in our life and that, they're a horror or something. That's going to erode relationships, make people very unhappy, cause significant conflict. When we look at the predictors of divorce, so this is John Gottman's work. Fascinating. He can predict a breakup or a divorce within 2 years with like 90% accuracy by observing a couple arguing for 15 minutes. It's cool research that he's done. But basically what he looks for is who makes the jabs and the conflict that increases, or the healing motions of resolving conflict whenever a couple is fighting. Those two things actually predict the health of a relationship in the long term. If a couple easily is poking at each other and, using a lot of criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, I think those are the four, that's what he measures, then that predicts divorce. So that's something that, you're asking, how do you console them after divorce? I really want to get at before divorce. Let's give some skills and prevent things from getting so bad. After a divorce, this is one of the most stressful things that somebody can experience. On the whole life events checklist, this whole scale we have to measure the most stressful things in the world that have been tons of research. Number one is loss of a partner through divorce or death. Number one, that's the most stressful thing a person could go through. So I think one thing we just have to honor that this is the most stressful thing that you can go through. So connect to people who care about you. Recreate your identity. It's a huge identity shift of being paired with somebody for so long and then, recreating yourself. I mean, people get so lost in that, understandably so. Focus on things that are recreating your identity, attach to things that you can just build over time that you have control over, and attach to a group that's going through things similar to you, because then you can see people having responded at all phases of the process. Somebody who's going through it just like you, and that's very validating, and somebody who's gotten through it, and that's inspiring. It's like a support group, something like that.
Super. Well, Dr. Bira, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And we look forward to seeing everybody next Monday. And remember, check your email for your Zoom link, and because we'll get those out to you way before next Monday. So everybody, thank you. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Miriam in Mind Science.